Good evening. It's such a wonderful night to see you all here and to see every seat full and knowing that there's a demand waiting for any seat that gets empty. We're beginning our third decade now, and we've decided to reinstate something wonderful from our past. How many of you are here tonight for the first time? A smattering of people. So we have a dedicated following, which is wonderful. Years ago, the Witte Lecture used to be followed by a dinner. And then times changed and economics changed, and the dinner fell by the wayside. A couple of years ago, we had some very young presenters called K&K. Many of you remember that night of spoken word. It was delightful. Thank you for that applause. And because they were young and we thought we'd have a very young population, and food trucks are popular now, it seemed like a good night to combine those things. So we did that. And it was just another wonderful night of an opportunity for people to stick around and share the pleasure of the evening. So starting this year, we've decided to reinstate the dinner and really give you an opportunity for a simple supper and some synthesis, perhaps. We'll be doing that for the next 3 lectures, and those events will be supported by Suzanne's Catering, and tonight by Bungalow Restaurant and an old favorite, High Time liquor, or High Time wine. It's just High Time and it's good, we know that. So we will continue our dialogue after our speaker tonight, where we can share our reactions and further our connection as a community. I think now, one of the things that we all feel is that we need not just social media, but looking at each other, talking to each other, and listening to each other's opinions and ideas. A tiny bit of housekeeping. Please turn your cell phone to silent. And do you all know that there is additional parking in the parking garage? Just to make it easier for some of you. Tonight we are honored to begin our series with David Frum. Many of you know him from television, from podcasts, and from his books, and it's just a privilege to have him here with us tonight. He's a senior editor at The Atlantic. He's a Canadian-American neoconservative political commentator who has served as a speechwriter for President George W. Bush in 2001 and 2002, and he frequently appears on CNN. Many of you watch that. He's the author of 9 books, including What's Right, The New Conservative Majority and the Remaking of America, The Right Man, The Surprise Presidency of George W. Bush, and his newest book, which will be available after tonight's presentation for you to purchase and to have signed, and it is Trumpocracy, The Corruption of the American Republic. So welcome again. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to our sponsors, who you can find listed in the flyer that's on your seat. Without our sponsors, these programs would not be possible. So you'll see sponsors that have these on if you want to know how you can become a sponsor, or if you'd like to thank a sponsor for making tonight possible. Don't hesitate to do that. And also our foundation is the Newport Beach Public Library Foundation. This happens under its auspices, and we love new members, and you may sign up tonight if you are not already a member. Thank you again. Without further ado, David Frum.
Thank you for those warm words, and thank you all for your attention tonight. Thank you to the Newport Beach Library and to the Witte family for their generous sponsorship. As you go about the country promoting a book, it's a very different experience from television or other kinds of more mass media. You speak to people in smaller groups, and you do so under the auspices of institutions like this library and through generosity like that of the Witte family. And you, as an author, are struck again and again with one of the great strengths of this country, which is its civic institutions. I will be speaking today about the nation and about national politics, and that will, to a great extent, be an ominous talk. But we are here today in one of the things that truly does make America great, and that is its healthy local civic institutions funded by local people who care about their community. So I thank you for that. It is inspiring to me. one of the difficulties of doing a tour like this is normally a book talk of the kind I'm about to deliver, like in the days of old-fashioned men's tailoring, you could get 5 or 6 uses out of it between cleanings. But in the Trump era, especially on a Friday night, the Trump Shabbat is the news dump. So tonight, we have 3 things. We have a second Trump staffer accused of spousal abuse, especially horrible story, if true, as the president says, he denies it. There are just so many people in the Trump administration who are innocent of the things they're accused of. It's really kind of, I've never seen a White House with so many innocent people in it. So we have this terrible story, and many of you will have seen the news. We have the president's decision that while he promptly released a memo that made these terrible accusations against the FBI, these quite incredible, if you know the FBI and know the kind of people who do the work of keeping us safe, both from criminals and foreign agents, the Trump administration released this ex parte, one-sided accusation against the FBI. It's not an accusation against the president's partisan opponents. It's an accusation against American law enforcement. And Representative Schiff from just up the road, he drafted a memo vindicating the FBI and saying, here are the reasons why the FBI acted as it did. And again, tonight we learned that will not be released. And the president actually makes a good point, because while the memo the president released contained no valid information of any kind, and therefore was not a threat to national security, the Schiff memo included evidence. And that evidence could be very upsetting if it came out, so it had to be hidden. And the third news dump is that the third-ranking official in the Department of Justice has resigned to take a job as the general counsel of Walmart. Congratulations to her and to her family. But it is ominous now, because this was the person who, if anything had happened to Rod Rosenstein, would be the person who would have the decision whether to continue or terminate the Mueller investigation. With her out of the picture, and with the difficulty the Trump administration has had in filling slots, the next in line is the Solicitor General, who is a much more political creature than the departing official of the Department of Justice. It just became that much more, the future of the Mueller investigation became just that much more uncertain today. So this was a big news day. I want, though, to step away from the news and to talk about something broader. Now, when people like me, and not just people like me in particular, when we go out to make statements, one of the things that people who are more sympathetic to the president than I am will say, well, you got the election wrong. You thought Hillary Clinton would win, that President Trump would not, so why should we listen to you? And they make a point, but I think a lot of the value of your analysis comes from the, it's not, you can have all of the evidence in place, do you read it properly? So my old friend, maybe known to some of you here, Norm Ornstein, he's a well-known student of Congress. He writes often. He's got a big Twitter presence. He's at the American Enterprise Institute, and he tells a story about a friend of his father's who had a passion for gambling on the horses. And he tells that this story took place some time ago in the past. In fact, a while ago, 1955, to be precise, the 5th of May, 1955. And on that morning, Norm Ornstein's friend woke up early, 5:55 a.m., and took the Fifth Avenue bus down to 55 Pine Street, and went to work, where he worked there as an accountant, and he had to balance a particularly tangled set of books from a corporation, but he worked all through the morning, and eventually he made the books balance at $55,555,000, 500, and so on. And see, at that point he broke for lunch, went to a neighboring deli, had a sandwich and a cup of coffee with tip, $5.55, and he realized God was sending him a sign. He went to the bank, withdrew all the cash in his checking account, $555, took a taxi to the old Aqueduct racetrack, put his money and bet all his money on the 5th horse in the 5th race, which naturally finished 5th. So the evidence can be all there. You just have to read it right. I'm especially grateful to be here because of the visionary quality of the invitation I got. I was invited to speak to you almost exactly a year ago. And at that time, the book that I'm hoping you will all purchase and give as gifts to your extended families. Some of you may have grandchildren. Each needs his or her. Like this is like if you want people to encourage reading, each grandchild must have his own. That book did not exist. That book was written the research for that book has been accumulating since 2014, and some of it went into the article in The Atlantic that I think got me this invitation, but the book was written over the summer of 2017, and it was a very strange experience to write this book because I wrote it on the North Shore of Lake Ontario in a tiny community in Canada where my family has been going now for 3 decades. One of the most serene, quiet places. It's so off the beaten track. When I'm there, I often think of a joke from Soviet days about the student who is summoned. He's applying to Moscow State University under the Soviet regime, and he's completed all of the qualifying tests. Now there is the test for political ideology, and he is interviewed. And he's given the question, "Tell me who is Vladimir Lenin?" And a blank look of terror crosses the student's face. He doesn't know. Well, who is the general secretary of the Soviet Union? Another blank look, I don't know. Well, can you at least tell me the system, the idea, the principles, the concept of our whole way of life here in the Soviet Union? It begins with the letter C. Can you tell me what that is? Another blank look. And the examiner says in amazement, "Where are you from?" So I'm from the village of Krasnoyarsk in eastern Siberia. He says, "It sounds like a wonderful place." And Wellington, Ontario is sort of like that. You do not wake up there with the feeling of nameless dread that you do when you wake up in Washington. But from that trans-border perspective, I spent a lot of time trying to work out in this book what the issues are and what the issues aren't. And I think one of the ways that this book, the reason I think it's met some response, is we all have a lot of emotions about the Trump presidency. And some people, by the way, are strong believers in the presidency, and that should never be forgotten. But we have a lot of emotions, and to channel those emotions in ways that make intellectual sense is a difficult task, especially when the onrush of events seems to happen so intensely. It is important to sort out what our problems are and what our problems are not. What are the issues of the day? What are the issues of the day, and what are the larger issues? One of the things, whatever your politics, one of the things that is your responsibility as a citizen of a mature democracy is to accept you don't get your way all the time. And everyone here has lived under presidents they liked more and under presidents they liked less. And sometimes the presidents you like less you may have voted for in the first place, but there's an understanding, a compact between the citizens. I did not vote for Barack Obama either time, but I always expected that my rights, my system of government, were safe in his hands. Not that I would like how he would use his power, and not that he wouldn't make me crazy from time to time. He made other people literally crazy. When I use crazy to mean upset. Other people he made crazy. And I'm sure there are many people here who feel the same way about the president I worked for, George W. Bush. When one of President Obama's early interviews on taking office, he was interviewed and he was asked about what had happened at Guantanamo Bay, about the CIA methods. These were intensely controversial, and he had opposed strenuously the policies of the Bush administration. He was asked by an interviewer, "What are you going to change and what are you going to keep?" And his answer to the interview began with this sentence: "Well, the first thing you have to understand is that President George W. Bush is a good man." And this new incoming president, who was about to keep some, reverse others of his policies, wanted to put into a context of depersonalizing and emphasizing the continuity of the American government. So I want to talk about what is discontinuous today, what is beyond Democrat, Republican, liberal, conservative. Because one of the things that's sort of striking about Donald Trump is he actually doesn't have much of an ideology. He doesn't have many political ideas. If asked given a multiple choice exam, he might put down a series of hasty check marks, but no one thing would link up to the other in any consistent way. And oftentimes, when he can give answers that sound surprisingly moderate and unextreme about a lot of questions. That is not what is remarkable about him. It is not that he is here with some extraordinarily powerful political agenda. What is different is the kind of administration he's running about all the things that normally we would think no president would differ about. No president since Lyndon Johnson has run a private business while in the White House. And President Johnson's private business was a couple of radio stations in Texas. And by the way, that wasn't the cleanest thing in the world. There were various regulatory things, and he did meet with, when there was he was a CBS affiliate, and when he had trouble with CBS, he would invite them to the White House to come talk about it. So that wasn't right. But no president since then has done anything like that. But it was a small business. It made Johnson a well-to-do man by the standards of the 1960s, but it was a small business. President Trump right now is receiving financial payments in the millions of dollars from business partners in the Philippines, Turkey, India, Argentina, the United Arab Emirates. Nobody knows how much because none of it has been disclosed. Nobody knows whether he's getting a dollar amount or whether there's some percentage or incentive basis to these fees. Nobody knows whether this represents a small part, a moderate part, a large part, or the vast majority of his personal income. These are things that no one ever thought to write any rules against because it never occurred to anybody that a president would do. Presidents are required to make by law certain disclosures. But the disclosure forms, I filled them out, and maybe some of you in this room have done, are designed to capture the usual kind of financial arrangements of affluent professional Americans, the kinds of people who tend to serve in government. So they're interested in who do you owe money to. They're interested in what stocks do you own, what bonds, where might you have a conflict of interest. They do not contemplate that you are the beneficiary of a vast upstream system of controlled corporations and trusts, which may have their own special purpose vehicles where the debt is stored. Donald Trump owes money. We get periodic glimpses of how much he owes and how much of it is owed abroad, but those forms don't capture it. They weren't designed to do it. Because of Donald Trump's massive financial exposures, he has certain kinds of legal liabilities. And he also has other legal liabilities because of the way he came into office. The whole question of his relationship with Russia remains to a great extent shrouded in obscurity. But what we know as fact, then there's much we do not know, but what we know as fact today, if you and I had sat down on the day before Donald Trump announced for president in June of 2015, and I said, by February 2018, here is what we will know about Donald Trump and his connections to Russian intelligence, you would have said, that's the biggest scandal in American history, by a lot. Alger Hiss, remember him? He gave the Russians a series of documents that had come his way while working as a mid-level official in the Department of Agriculture. And that was a big deal. And this is now the presidency of the United States. But because it's been revealed bit by bit, we keep saying, well, when does the big reveal come? Not knowing that the big reveal is in the rearview mirror. That also creates exposure. And because the president has these financial exposures and these national security exposures, he's in a position where simply for survival, he has to begin one by one turning off the burglar alarms of the American government. Mechanisms and institutions and rules that have been set up to prevent this kind of thing from happening, they have to be shut down. My book has a few big master ideas in it. It's got a lot of material, but there are a few master ideas. One of the master ideas in the book is it's an argument against those who, when Donald Trump was elected, said, oh my God, this is like something out of William Shirer. This is where this is like the collapse of democracy in Germany in the 1930s. History doesn't repeat itself. One of my favorite teachers in college used to say, history never repeats itself, it only appears to do so to those who don't pay attention to the details. But you cannot take an instance from something that happened in one of the worst moments in human history and transport it 80 years later into times of prosperity and general peace and stability and expect history to repeat itself. That Donald Trump is not the heart attack of American democracy. He is the gum disease of American democracy. A slow festering that he is doing for not with a big idea in mind, not to be a dictator, but just to keep out of trouble. Like every journalist in Washington, I read the Michael Wolff book with fascination. And I must say, I mean, we all, of course, every author resents and envies every other author, but I actually, most of my reaction was a kind of, he does things I wouldn't do, but he also does things I couldn't do. I have a lot of respect for his accomplishment and amazement that he was able, his method was he got himself signed into the White House. And there's in the West Wing, you've seen the front of the West Wing, just behind where those Marines are, there's a kind of cloakroom, and then beyond that, there's a reception area. It's really quite small. It's maybe twice the size of this clear area here. And there's a couple of cabinets with some plates in it that are always the same, and a couch and a couple of armchairs in which very few people ever sit. And he would park himself there for 6 hours and just buttonhole people as they went by. And like in my day, if he'd been there for 6 minutes beyond his scheduled appointment time, that there would have been a phalanx of aides saying, you know, what are you doing here? Why haven't you left? But no one ever asked. It's kind of amazing. But with the respect, I have one great caveat about the book. Besides its, there are various kinds of errors of emphasis and omission. I have one big caveat, which is that he presents an image of a president who is basically a pretty pathetic figure. His power's waning, no concentration, no ability to execute, commands no respect from any of the people around him. And my reading of the president is that while he is incredibly, it is true that he is uninformed and indifferent and unenergetic about the parts of the job that a president is supposed to do. When it comes to the parts of the job that a president is not supposed to do, he can be very energetic. He's wily, and most importantly, he has a will to power, unlike anybody at least since Lyndon Johnson, and maybe more than him. He's like a powerful gravitational ball that bends people around him. He changes people. He takes people who are, like most of us, have capacities for good and for bad, and he somehow suppresses their capacity for good and exaggerates their capacity for bad, and takes people who have been honorable public servants their whole lives, military people of distinction and courage, and he wrecks them. And it's horrifying and it's tragic. I mean, General Kelly, who's today so much in the news, is getting a lot of bad press. You need to remember the previous part of this man's incredibly distinguished patriotic career, the son he lost for this country, the pain he suffered, the risks he took. This is someone to admire. And he has been bent. And not because he doesn't have great strength himself, but because he is meeting a force that nothing in his past career prepared him to meet. This is what I would criticize, and this is the thing we need to take in mind when we take the measure of the president. The president, for his own reasons, as a wily survivor, as a man of power, is taking control of parts of the government without any kind of orderly plan, without even knowing exactly how the government works, and breaking it. The United States government, to be in a White House, I often compare it, this is maybe an obscure historical comparison, but we're in a library, I can do it. You often feel like one of the riders in the Manchurian conquest of China in the 1650s. I mean, you and your 300 horsemen from the plains ride in, and you take over the capital, and you win. And they install you all in palaces, and they give you silks and beautiful food and tea, and you give them orders in Manchurian, and they bilingually tell you, absolutely, we'll do that. And then they go out to a city of 10 million people and speak Chinese to one another, and you have no idea what is happening. And then you call them back and say, did you carry out my order? And they say in Manchurian, oh yes, absolutely. And then they go back out and say in Chinese, the 10 million people, get a look of, that guy from the sticks. That simply to find out what is going on is very difficult. The government is made up of these giant bureaucracies, each with its own purposes and plans and history. And what we call the White House is really, it's actually a number of buildings staffed by close to 3,000 people who together have the job of coordinating the actions of all of these bureaucracies. Let me start with one that probably you don't think of as a coordinating body, the Office of National Drug Control Policy. That's the body that is headed by the person we call the drug czar. What do they do? Well, there are at least half a dozen, or at least 5 and maybe half a dozen agencies that set drug policy. There's the Drug Enforcement Agency, there's the Department of Justice, there's Health and Human Services, there's the FDA, which regulates prescription drugs, and all of them have their own approach to the issues of addiction. The Office of National Drug Control Policy is to make sure they all, the Department of Justice wants to send everybody to jail. The Department of Health and Human Services wants to put everybody in treatment. The DEA wants to do raids outside the borders of the United States. The FDA is often captured by the opioid makers. Somebody has to coordinate and make sure all of these people are working together. It's been a year, and there is not a head of the Office of National Drug Control Policy. President Trump just announced one today, but we'll see whether that goes anywhere. The same thing, but more importantly and more extremely, is true at the National Security Council and other agencies. And he's breaking these agencies because they are the restraints on his power. They are the people who get in his way. One thing President Trump does believe, and this is as close to an ideology as he has, is that the only possible relationship between human beings is one of domination. You are either dominating or being dominated. You're either a winner or you're a loser. I think one of the things that those of you who are business people, even if you hadn't been following the career of Donald Trump, the one way you would know he was not really the businessman that he says he is the way he talks about deals. I'm going to make a great deal. It's great for me. It's bad for you. Every successful businessman knows in almost any industry, the people you deal with are the people today, are the people you're going to deal with next year. And they need that the deals that make you rich are the deals that also make them rich. And the people want to do business with you. And they can't, your word is good, your promises are kept, you care about quality. If there's a problem, you're eager to work it out. That a reputation for commercial morality is one of the greatest assets a businessman can have. A reputation for never paying your bills. One of the reasons the president gets the worst lawyers in America, despite being the president of the United States, is because all the good lawyers know he won't do what the lawyer says, and he won't pay the bills. But this has huge consequences, not just for our government, for America's place in the world. Because while he's breaking these institutions that bring the government together, he is also breaking the alliance structure on which American power in the world rests. The United States, since 1945, has occupied a unique position in the entire history of world power. Since great states began to emerge 500 years ago, there was always one that was the strongest. And that state became the enemy of all the other states who had band together to tear down the strongest state because it was dangerous. When the United States emerged as the strongest state after World War II, that could have happened to the United States. Instead, America said, we're going to build an order which is so good for everybody else that our power will become not a threat to you, but an asset to you. And you will willingly support us because it's such a good deal that you would be fools not to. What President Trump doesn't understand, that the global security system, that means that France and Germany don't have big armies pointed at each other, that's not a defect in the world we built since World War II. That was the plan. That was always the plan. There would not be a big German army. You guys focus on the cars. The French, wine, butter, pâté. We will provide so much security for everybody that you will never have to take up arms against each other again, and we will always listen to you. And you will know if you get into a trade dispute with us, Denmark can win. If the Danes, there's law, and by the way, and not only can Denmark win, but the case will not even be heard by an American. We will have international tribunals, and there will be a Finn and a Canadian and a Norwegian and a Paraguayan, and they will decide whether the Danish claim against the United States prevails or fails. That is the thing he has never understood, and that is the other thing that he is breaking. This system, the president's methods of government, I called Trumpocracy. That's the title of the book. And the reason I use that title is because I want to make clear that we are talking not about one person, but about a system of power. Donald Trump on his own is the least bankable name in New York real estate, and not much more. In this system of control of the executive branch, of the subordination of others to his will, of his relationship with a Congress that doesn't like him but needs him, in his connection to the big donors in the Republican world, and in his support with from the Republican Party in the country, he has built a system of power that allows him to govern in ways unlike those that other presidents have done. My book details a lot of how this system of power works, but in the final few minutes or final quarter hour of our time together, I want to talk a little bit about where the system comes from, what it rests on. Because one of the things we've always believed is that these kinds of things don't and can't happen in the United States. The civics we were all taught presented an image of how the presidency, that the president governed by consent, the president governed by persuasion, the president was not a king, there were real limits. Where is this coming from? Where's this new situation in the country coming from? And then, and this is where I will end, where are we going? The story of the past 20 years has been a story of three forces driving the politics of the United States. The first has been the general slowdown of economic growth from 1999 until the day before yesterday. It looks like we're going to clear 2.5% growth in 2017. We've had a number of those years where it looks like we're getting back above 2.5. 2014 looked like a promising year, and then we fall back down. But in the first 10 years of the decade, the growth was really very disappointing. Slower growth, less to go around. The aging of the baby boom, which means that the biggest generation, the most politically potent generation in American history, is reaching the age of maximum claims on the state at exactly the time when there is less to go around. Intensifying inequality, which means that what there is to go around is taken by a comparatively few people. There were years during the first part of this recovery since 2010, where 100% of all of the economic growth, of all of the proceeds of economic growth, was taken by the top 10% of the country, and 90% of the country, even though the economy was growing, saw no improvement in their standard of living. Both causing and resulting from this is the greatest health crisis in American history. Among people who didn't go to college, especially among white people who didn't go to college, life expectancy is declining, which is something that did not happen during the Great Depression. It's unprecedented. In fact, it has never happened in peacetime in any developed country. The only place where anything like this has happened is in the post-Soviet republics, where alcoholism and industrial accidents and the collapse of the whole moral architecture of the society led people to do things that shorten their lives. Well, that is happening in the America, between from the Mojave to the Alleghenies. You see this tremendous collapse. You see this explosion of addiction and deaths of despair. Americans are less likely to wear seatbelts than people in any other developed country. I mean, most Americans do, but an astonishing number of Americans don't. Accidents, self-inflicted gun fatalities, the way Americans eat, the way they don't take care of themselves. There is something that all of these economic problems then express themselves also in a crisis of self-care that has swept the country. Americans are living more isolated lives. If you ask questions like, do you have close friends? The number of Americans who answer yes to that question is declining. If you ask this question, this is one I saw the other day in a survey, it was really alarming, have you left the house in the past 24 hours? Even if you adjust for age and leave out the people who are over 85, that number is rising. People say, no, I have not left the house in 24 hours. I mean, you get a picture of a country of economic disappointment, health crisis, loneliness, alienation, and all of this is coinciding with the greatest wave of immigration in the history of the world. So people are having all of these problems at a time when their country is changing before their eyes at breathtaking speed, and in which many people are saying, I am going to reach my old age in a country that is a different country from the country in which I grew up. This is creating a crisis of democracy, because if you watch Fox News, if you watch other sort of more conservative media, one of the things that is always very striking there is the insistence that President Trump speaks for the will of the people. Now, just as a countable fact, that cannot be true. Donald Trump got through his first year as the least popular president in the history of polling. He won election with half a point more of the vote than Michael Dukakis, half a point less than Mitt Romney, and considerably less than John Kerry or Al Gore. In what sense does he express a will of the people, as you'll hear? And part of it is just disinformation and people talking for the sake of talking. But there's something else that is going on, which is I think a lot of those talkers have a concept that although there's some 330 million people resident within the boundaries of the United States, they're not all proper Americans. About two-thirds of them are proper Americans. One-third of them are some other kind of American. And among the proper Americans, Donald Trump does command a majority, or so they say. He probably doesn't command a majority even among the proper Americans. But if you shrink the number of proper Americans enough, you can eventually arrive at some quantum where he does. But what is happening here is that people are redefining, in order to hold on to some concept of democratic legitimacy, people are redefining what it means to be an American in a way that is against a considerable number of their fellow citizens. And that way of thinking is leading people to reconceptualize. When you say democracy, you mean a system by which every person resident in the country has some claim to citizenship, some claim to participation, and political power is decided by some kind of tally in which the larger number prevail, subject to respect for the legitimate rights of the minority, but with the majority making the major decisions of public policy, the majority at any given moment making the decisions on the major issues of public policy of the day. This is made complicated by the federal system, where there are national majorities and local majorities, but that's the idea. But once you get the right to cut people out, what looked like you may preserve the forms of democracy, but you lose the content of democracy. And all of this is happening in the throes of another giant, complex social change that is forced to our attention by these two atrocious stories of spousal abuse at the highest levels, well, one at a very high level of the White House and one at a medium level of the White House, which is we are living through a real convulsion in the relationships between men and women in this country. And a lot of what Donald Trump is about is an assertion of a certain understanding of the respective places and rights of men and of women. And here's a remarkable thing, for those of you, and I think it's probably something that those of you who have children and grandchildren under 30 probably worry about a lot. I know I do. If you ask this question, are you married or living with a person of the opposite sex? Among people under 30, the percentage answering yes is at the lowest level in the history of record keeping. I mean, you have to go back to the days of before the Civil War and boarding houses to get a number as low of people under 30 married or living with a person of the opposite sex. So we say grim-facedly, well, we know what's going on here. It's this hookup culture I keep reading so much about. But if you ask, have you had sex in the past 3 months? You get, among people under 30, the lowest yes answer since before the sexual revolution of the middle 1960s. There is this coming apart of young men and young women at a time when you have a transformation in the economy that makes traditional male attributes of upper body strength way less valuable, and which makes traditional female attributes of interpersonal skill and sociability and good group dynamics more valuable than ever. And into the throes of this crisis in relations between the sexes comes America's first female major party nominee for president, who is met by someone who asserts male power in its most brutal form. And that ramifies all the way through his whole system of power. And that is, if you say, what do all the Trump people have in common? That is really it. There are women there, but they'd better dress nicely if they want to stay there. The men, on the other hand, can be the biggest trolls they want to be. It's like an Italian game show. You know, you've got the hideous house surrounded by all the beautiful women. This is where we are. This is where are we going? It's two things I think to understand the future need to be kept in mind. The first is the global background. I have been describing an American situation, but it's very important to understand that what has happened to us is not an American problem. You can find parallels to Donald Trump in almost every developed country. There is a Trump-like party that's now the second biggest party in the Netherlands. In France, the National Front doubled its share of the vote between 2002 and 2017. Germany has a authoritarian populist party in the national parliament for the first time since the last time, and that didn't end so well. You see, in Italy, you have such a party, but it's a party of the left. Many of these parties have DNA of the right. In Italy, it's a party of the left. Jeremy Corbyn in the United Kingdom, the Labour Party, is somebody who is as defensive of Stalinists as Donald Trump is sympathetic to neo-Nazis. This is going on around the world. And there are many factors, and I talk about them in the book, but here is one I don't use many statistics when I give talks because they're hard to remember, but here's one I do want you to take home with you and keep in mind. And this is quite a solid one, a piece of research by a German political scientist named Yascha Mounk. He got a big grant to do a survey across many different countries, I think about 18. And he asked this one question: is it essential to live in a democracy? Among people born in the 1930s, about 90% said yes, all across the developed world. With each decade younger, the number saying yes dropped, until you got those born since 1980, and in that group, only about a quarter said yes. And that is true in Sweden and Canada and Germany, as well as in the United States. That there is a global retreat from the idea of democracy as not just a desirable, but an essential, something worth fighting for, something worth laying down your life for, as people did between 1941 and 45, or 1939 and 45. That belief is fading. And that is what makes so much of this possible. We're not just dealing with some blip, some glitch, some accident that will be corrected. We have a deep dilemma about the legitimacy of our system of government, because for many people it is seen as delivering only talk and chaos and conflict and not the goods, not the way of making life better. Against this background, where we are tending is somewhere I think quite dangerous. The Mueller investigation may go forward, it may be interrupted at some point. But here is what if I asked to predict, here is what I foresee. As I said, what we know already about the connection between Donald Trump and Russia is extremely disturbing, and enough to be an enormous scandal. And perhaps there is more. But I venture, at the end of the day, we will find these things: that many laws were broken, but the laws that were broken tend to be rather technical ones. But election law, but registering as a foreign agent, and they will involve people on the periphery of Trump world. Meanwhile, it will, I believe, be established that the people at the very center did engage in very close contacts with Russia. But when Trump's talkers on TV say collusion is not a crime, they are not wrong. The core evil of an American presidential candidate sitting in a room, meeting with representatives of a hostile foreign power, and saying, how can we work together in secret in order to elect us and achieve things that you want done? How do we work together? That, if you stay away from the offenses against election law, and you don't get involved in the hacks yourself, and and anyone who's a technical foreign agent registers properly, and all the taxes are paid, that act itself is probably not a violation of any law. It's an attack on democracy, it's un-American, it's unpatriotic, but it's probably not unlawful. And when this all comes into public view, we are going to have a terrible argument in this country, where many Americans, your neighbors, your relatives, maybe people in this room, will find themselves saying, along with such distinguished luminaries of the law as Alan Dershowitz and Professor Jonathan Turley, we don't like what just happened, but we don't see anything that can be done about it. It's not illegal, and because it's not illegal, therefore you don't have a right to complain, because in America things are either legal, they're either crimes, or they're fine. America is a very legalistic country. We don't have a concept of anything between crime, fine. And the idea of, well, you shouldn't do it, it's terrible. You're a bad person if you do that, you're un-American, that tends to be excluded. And that is the argument where we are going. And it's going to rip the country apart, because that is an argument that will also match to the divisions between men and women, to the divisions between ethnicities, to the divisions between races, to the most fundamental division of all in this country, and that is the division between those who are doing well in this new world we are moving into, in one way or another, and those who are being left behind in this new world, and the resentments and mistrust between those two groups. And yet, through this grim scenario, and this is where I think we have to end, and not just because this is how you end your talk, but because it's deeply true. Through all of this, I think we must reject not only despair, but pessimism. My motto is think like a pessimist, act like an optimist. Because one of the things that has been inspiring to me from the day I began to conclude the book, and certainly in the period since I've been talking to people about it, is the extraordinary shafts of light of hope that I have seen. And part of it is the fact that, your presence here is an example of that. I am not so vain as to think you're here for me. I mean, you happen to be here to hear me tonight, but you're not here because of me. You're here because of the topic. You're here because you're concerned for the country, and you're here because of each other, because these kinds of anxieties are dealt with, cannot be dealt with by a person alone watching television. That only makes you more scared and more helpless. Franklin Roosevelt spoke of the courage that comes from national unity. People feel stronger and more effective when they group together. And you see in libraries and civic centers, one of the things I feared that would happen from the Trump presidency is that we would see an explosion of protests of the most counterproductive kind. Flag burning, people carrying the Mexican flag, trouble, riots, fighting with police. Instead, what has been striking is, well, demonstrations have been quite comparatively rare in the Trump years. And where they have happened, they have been amazingly orderly. The Women's March at the inauguration and then the anniversary, I don't remember exactly what happened at the anniversary march. At the first Women's March, there were 500,000 people there. There was not a single arrest. No one even so much as bumped into and knocked over a garbage can, which can get you arrested in Washington. I'm a Canadian. I think that's right. You litter, prison. We have seen this extraordinary rise of civic engagement. Everyone who writes for a living knows that not only are more people reading you, they're reading you in a different way, as if it really mattered. And what they are taking away from the sense of civic engagement is a wider sphere of sympathy. It has been understandable, but also easy. First, in the difficult years of the Bush presidency, when the country was engaged in difficult and unsuccessful wars, and then during the Obama presidency when everybody had so many economic problems of his or her own, to lose sight of the fact that some parts of the country were responding to the 21st century much more successfully than others. And people who are your fellow citizens, your fellow Americans, for whom you are responsible, they were dying earlier and earlier. They were not taking part in this new world. They were people who they were not eating food that you would regard as proper food for people to eat. They had never seen a museum in their lives, and no one seemed to care about them, and they knew it. The Trump presidency has opened our eyes to this and created a wider sympathy. I think the Trump presidency has also brought an end to some stagnant political debates. I mean, we've had 25 years from 1990 to 2015 where everything in the world seemed to change. The internet was invented. China, overtook Japan as the world's second largest economy and nearly caught up to the United States. But in politics, it was Bush, Clinton, Clinton, Bush. In Gingrich, 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 Gingrich. And we talked about the Iraq and the deficit and healthcare, and then Iraq some more, and then the deficit, and then healthcare some more. And nothing important seemed to happen in Washington, even as everything was changing all around Washington. That's 25 years where things froze between 1990 and 2015. You go back 25 years from 1990 to 1965, and the whole political world is different. The most powerful man in Washington is the head of the AFL-CIO. There are segregationist Democrats and liberal Republicans. A government passes laws every day, all the time. It's a different universe. I think the kind of dynamism you saw between 65 and 90 is normal in a country like this, and what you saw between 1990 and 2015 is abnormal, and Trump has thrown all of that in the air, and we are seeing new political alignments in which Americans who have been on the left have suddenly realized, you know what, the people at the FBI, the CIA, and the NSA, they defend us just as much as the Army, Navy, and Marines do. Their work is necessary. And the impulse to make heroes of people like Edward Snowden and Julian Assange, that those people are no more heroes than people who would give away the whereabouts of men on patrol or a ship at sea. I think on the political right, or at least that part of it that has been shaken loose by the Trump years. One of the things that defines, I think, American conservatism, I'm speaking very much of my own experience, tend to be very easygoing about the minor unfairnesses of life. That life is easier for some people than for others. That's just the way it is, especially since we're the people for whom it's easier, so it's very easy to accept. Donald Trump has taken all of those petty cruelties. In the past 48 hours, we've seen some of those cruelties are not so petty. I mean, they're the violent laying of hands on people. And he has put them on a jumbotron in the center of American life for everyone to look at and say, how do you like this when it's blown up 10,000 times? And you have to say, I don't like that at all. People sometimes ask me, what do you dislike most about Donald Trump? What most fundamentally bothers you? So I don't like the corruption. I don't like the connection to Russia. I don't like the slovenliness and the ignorance. But the thing that most foundationally bothers me is he's cruel. He's cruel. He's cruel to his loved ones. He's cruel to his staff. He's cruel to the people who work with him. He's cruel to anyone who gets in his way and isn't used to him. And the beginning, there's a lot of loose talk about resistance. I don't like to use that word. I think if you're not in danger of being tortured, if you're captured by the authorities, you don't get to call yourself the resistance. But the dissent, or even better, the transcendence. I think the message of the Trump experience is that the importance of kindness as a foundational political virtue. That watching him makes us rethink ourselves. Because I had a conversation this summer at a conference up the road in Los Angeles where somebody full of passion came up and said the only way to stop Donald Trump is we have to learn from him, we have to copy him, we have to take his methods as our own. And I said, if you do that, you will only replace him. You will not overcome him. That the way you overcome him is by being the opposite. And where he is cruel, you must be kind. Where he is vengeful, you must be forgiving. Where he sets people against one another, you must be conciliatory. The only way you stop him is by becoming a better person and a better citizen. It's a crazy kind of gift, but it is a gift. And I think we should take it in that spirit. And I'm happy to take some questions from you if you'd like to ask them. Thank you. Thank you for the lights. George H.W. Bush got himself into trouble by reading the cue cards, message I care. So I've got a cues card here that says, please repeat the questions for the live audience, and I will honor this injunction. So ask your question, I will hear it and then say it out loud. And I have to say, in order to read my notes, I'm not wearing my contact lenses, so I don't see the back of the room as well as the front. So if you're in the back and you want to ask a question, please put your hand up high, and may I particularly encourage women to ask questions, because I know what happens is that in rooms like this, the men ask the questions for the first 20 minutes, and then there's 2 minutes left, and the women finally say, okay, I'll break my inhibitions, and then there's 2 minutes left. So put your hands up early and often. Thank you.
Okay, can you elaborate more on the shafts of light that you see right now?
The shafts of light, I have been struck. Can you elaborate on the? Thank you. No, I was about to. I'm sorry. I said the shafts of light I see. What are they? The shafts of light I see. I think I tried to enumerate them, but the shaft of life that I am most impressed by is the spirit of responsibility that you see in a lot of the opposition to President Trump. This is not a 1968 moment with angry protests against Richard Nixon. It's not a 1998 moment where the people who dislike Bill Clinton took refuge in some pretty wild conspiracy theories. I think that there has been slowness and method and a desire to learn the truth. And maybe the truth is the key thing here, because you've all heard this phrase, post-truth. There's a description of the Trump years. But the phrase post-truth originated as a compliment, not as a criticism. It originated in the universities, and the idea was there's something tyrannical about the idea of a single truth, and we need multiple truths. Oprah Winfrey referenced this at the Golden Globe when she talked about different people having different truths. I think one of the things we've learned in the Trump years is the opposite in politics of truth is not truths, but lying. And truth is precious. And it's especially precious to a democracy. I mean, we're 3,000 miles from Washington? It's hard if you're going to vote in meaningful ways, you need accurate information, which you cannot possibly get yourself from this distance. So you rely on structures of information. And when people arise who say, my business model is built on deceiving my customers, that they actually make democratic government incredibly difficult. And I think we have all learned that, and I think that is, I think we hear that more, and you will hear less about truths and more about truth, and I welcome that. Yes, sir.
At the beginning of your presentation, you spoke about the enterprises that the president still controls to this day, international, stretching from one end of the globe to the other. Why is it that challenge, that emolument challenge, never got suggest otherwise.
Okay. Why did the Emoluments Clause not have more bite and effect against the president? The Emoluments Clause of the Constitution says the president cannot accept any emolument from any foreign sovereign, has been understood by American law to mean two things that do not affect Trump. First, it applies to governments, not to private people. So President Trump may not accept, a title of nobility or a gratuity from the government of Malaysia. But if the brother-in-law of the Prime Minister of Malaysia, who happens to be the richest man in the country, cuts the Trump family into a 25% share of a shopping center development, that's not an emolument because it's not coming from a foreign government. The second problem is that the Emoluments Clause only applies to the president personally. It does not apply to his children. And so Donald Trump, when he signed that form, theoretically separating himself from it's preposterous. That he put his holdings into a trust. All the income of the trust flows to him. He is entitled to all the information from the trust. He can reclaim full ownership at any time. It's like saying I'm putting moving my change into my left pocket because I'm right-handed, so it's harder for me to reach, and therefore I don't own my change anymore. But it's not an emoluments clause. And one of the things that is going to happen if we get through all of this is I think we're going to see a generation of legal activism to try to write laws to prevent people from doing again what Donald Trump did. But that's got a real problem to it because I assume that the next time there's a Democratic president and a Democratic Congress, they will make it no longer optional for the president and the major party nominees to release their tax returns. That will become compulsory, and we'll probably have stricter disclosure laws, and maybe they will apply them to the president's immediate relatives as well as the president himself. But remember the point I made about how Americans tend to think that things are either criminal or fine, that the more you write things down, the more you remove the sense, and democracies need this, of things that aren't forbidden, but you just shouldn't do them. And the more things you forbid, the more you suggest that the things that are not forbidden are not only permissible, but actually uncriticizable. Take a question from this side of the room. Yes, sir.
Is there anything that you can point to since the Trump presidency of a positive nature that the administration created?
Sure. Yeah, I know. Look, administrations do hundreds of things. Sorry, I beg your pardon. I didn't read the card. Can I point to anything positive that the administration has done? And administrations do hundreds of things a day, and White Houses do tens of things a day. So I can point to many things that have happened that are positive. 2017 was a good year economically. 2018 is shaping up to be better, and even this chaos in the stock market, I think, is actually a weird sign of health, because the stock market is saying we're expecting the era of cheap money to be over, interest rates to rise. Well, what does that mean? Well, for a long time, people couldn't think of anything to do with capital, and people with capital had to accept a 1% return. Now there are more people bidding for capital, and there are going to be 3% returns, and that's a sign of economic vitality. That's I think, if it goes to 6, we're in trouble. But that 3 is healthy, so that's a good thing. I think there are particular things that have been done that are good things. I'm happy that we're not pretending that Jerusalem isn't the capital of Israel anymore. And I think. Some of the particular decisions about military spending have been good. I welcome the end of the sequestration of the military, especially because we have a lot of wounded warriors to take care of. And so the Veterans Department and other things, and not just the immediate physical care of veterans. One of the things about modern warfare is it inflicts traumatic wounds that people survive, but that hurt not only their bodies but their spirits. And we are only discovering, and that's going to be very expensive to care for. So those are positive things. But are there things that make me think Donald Trump is a good president? And then I'm faced with it because I'm broadly sympathetic to the Republican agenda. But the question I have to wrestle with, and if those of you who are more on the liberal side, I invite you to imagine if you had a president like Donald Trump who came from your tradition. How much do I want these things? What price am I prepared to pay? I am glad the corporate income tax is 21% and not 35%. That makes the individual side of the tax cut, I think, is a lot of giveaways that don't make a lot of sense. And there are a lot of things in the court. I don't understand why timber now pays a lower capital gains rate than what's so great about timber, that a timber gain is lower than everybody else's gain, and motor speedways. I can believe that a strong America can have a weak motor speedway industry. But do I want it so much that I accept the other things? And for me, I would say the answer to that is no. Let me take something from the very back there in the center, sir. What is Eric Snyderman's role? That's a really interesting and well-informed question. Eric Snyderman is the Attorney General of New York, and where Donald Trump is a resident. One of the forgotten things about American law is before Franklin Roosevelt federalized financial regulation in the 1930s, the state of New York was the most important financial regulator in the country. And New York still has on its books a lot of pre-1933 laws about commercial morality. Some of them that are written in sort of an more old-fashioned and vaguer way, like if I remember right, one of them is it's illegal to send a wire transfer for a fraudulent purpose in the state of New York. So that means there's a category of New York financial crimes that are not double jeopardied, even if the president were to pardon a member of his family who's convicted or accused of a federal crime. And of course, a New York Attorney General who successfully prosecuted the Trump family would be a pretty strong candidate for the Democratic nomination for governor of New York. Back there, ma'am. Yes. I'm sorry. Actually, why don't you both ask your questions together and then visit? As I said, I'm not wearing my contact lenses. I didn't see that there were two arms. So both of you ask your questions together. Yes. Got it. Okay. And,
Mine's totally different. In response to what you said about how when the Democrats are reelected again, or whatever, that they will probably look into making the tax returns having to be, or having to be revealed. My question is, why do you think the Republicans aren't doing it now?
okay. Actually, those two questions do align. So question one is midterm elections predictions, and question two is why aren't the Republicans in Congress more active now? And those two relate in the following way. So I expect, first of all, that 2018 will be a better year for President Trump than 2017 has been. The economy's strong. Wages are rising. And the rest of America says thank you to California because there's a big tax increase on many of the people in this room, which will be used to fund mostly the corporate tax cut, but to some degree that will give tax relief to a number of middle-income parents in low-tax states. Will they like it? They will like it. You won't like it, but they will like it. So I think the president will get a little bit stronger, and meanwhile, he will get stronger at a time when the rest of his party is getting weaker. So his power relative to the Republican world will increase, as it has been increasing since the beginning of the presidency. And that's the answer to the second question, because the Republicans in Congress made a pact with President Trump. He would sign their bills, many of those bills very unpopular or at least hazardous, and in return, they would give him impunity. Mitch McConnell does not love President Trump. I mean, famously, he can hardly stand to stay on the phone with him and will not say good morning. He just calls him, these very businesslike calls. And Paul Ryan, who's a man of very fierce opinions, strong ideology, but it's important to Paul Ryan. I mean, he has a modern marriage, he has a good family, he's an affectionate father. I mean, he cannot find much to admire in this president. He probably doesn't like very much to be in his kind of company. And all of these people have histories where Donald Trump has been insulting or abusive to them. Remember, Donald Trump came within an inch of backing a Republican primary challenger to Paul Ryan in 2016. Ryan eventually crushed this guy by 65 points or something like that in the Republican primary before the guy revealed himself as a demented Twitter anti-Semite. And the president came within inches of endorsing him. And a lot of the people in the Breitbart world really did endorse him. But there's a pact, and they need him, and they are going to need him more and more as 2018 unfolds. Yes, sir.
1 year into the presidency, do you have a feel on the morale of the staff, employees, and Washington, D.C.?
Well, I don't know. I know one person on the White House staff, and we haven't really spoken for a while, so I don't have any insight inside the White House. But different departments have different feelings. if you're at the Department of Defense across the river in the Potomac, consumed with the very complicated internal politics of the Department of Defense, the Trump presidency is something you're reading about online the same as anybody else. It's just not really that close to you. And they have there's a very powerful and politically savvy Secretary of Defense who holds the president considerably at bay. Secretary Mattis was asked how he felt about the prospect of a giant parade in Washington, D.C., and he answered, "I'm not paid to have feelings, those are for my wife." And I assume what happens is if President Trump does give the order for the giant parade, the Pentagon will have that order studied very, very carefully. It will take a while because there are a lot of complicated issues to, like, what happens to the Washington streets? You take what happens to the paving? Complicated question. It'll need some months. We'll get right back to you, though. Promise. But there are other places where I know, like the State Department, the morale is crushed. The most interesting question, and the most mysterious to me, is what's going on at the FBI. And I ask you to ask this: how do we suddenly know that there were 2 wife beaters inside the White House? How do we know that? And I think I'm reminded of I'm not reminded, I am inspired to coin what I think will be a rule of Washington for the next administration: never get into a leak war with the FBI. Yes, sir.
So I think a lot of the outrage is against the people that are appointed by the administration to run the agencies.
Yeah.
Totally opposed to that. I don't give him enough credit to actually come up with those nominations.
Yeah.
I think they're really funneled to him by, the Koch brothers and the Pence and the Stephen Miller and these kind of people. So, I mean, if we take Trump out, does it really make any difference?
Well, I said the question is, how do you feel about there are people running agencies who are pretty radical? How does one feel about that? And so I'm not going to tell you how to feel about it, but here's how I would think about it. I said at the very beginning that you need to distinguish, or it's useful to distinguish between what is happening here that would be happening as part of the normal give and take of politics, where you don't win them all, and what would not. So supposing Scott Walker were president right now, which could have happened. I don't know that Betsy DeVos would literally be Secretary of Education, but somebody very like her would be Secretary of Education. I don't know that Scott Pruitt literally would be head of the EPA, but something like that would. This is what would happen. The Republican Party is generally a more radical entity than it was a decade ago. Had a Republican won in 2016, you would get many of these things. The difference this time is if Scott Walker were president, you would be able to read his tax returns. If Scott Walker were president, he would be actively working to prevent the Russians from interfering in the 2018 election. And if Scott Walker had been the Republican nominee and he discovered the Republicans were trying to help him, he would be angry and ashamed and would be going through his staff and saying, "Is anybody here involved with this? I'm turning you over. And by the way, obviously, Michael Flynn cannot be my national security advisor." So you don't have to like any of those. You don't have to like Betsy DeVos. I mean, it's a free country, obviously. You don't need my permission. But understand, there are different orders of thing here, from the things that are specifically Trumpist, and there are things that happen when the people you don't like, if I assume correctly that you don't like them, when they get their turn at the executive, at control of the executive branch. Can I? Yes.
What are the effects on democracy of the Supreme Court decision what's it called?
Citizens United. What are the effects on democracy of the Citizens United decision? So the Citizens United decision is actually there are a pair of decisions that happened about the same time in 2010. One at the Supreme Court, Citizens United, and then there was a related case at the DC Circuit, which is the most important of the circuit courts, that together recognized the full free speech rights of corporations, including the right for corporations to do third-party advertising in presidential campaigns. So here's, the consequences are large, but I don't know how the court could have arrived at another decision. Corporations have been treated as legal persons in common law for hundreds of years. And corporations have been recognized in the United States as having political rights since the early days of the Republic, since the 1820s 20s or something like that. Charles River Bridge case, if I'm remembering. They're proper lawyers here. You'll remember better than I do. So if they're people, and if they have political rights, it's hard to understand how it's illegal for them to have political speech. So it's sort of I don't know how you back away from that. I also tend to think that the consequences of these decisions tend to be exaggerated, because the rising power of money in American politics is a very spectacularly visible thing. But here's the question I wrestle with as I think about the power of money in American politics. Why was money so much less powerful in, say, 1960 than it was today? Not because all of the reforms to limit the power of money are all post-Watergate, 1975. There are a few that come from before, but almost all of the structure of campaign finance regulations is a middle 1970s creation. And yet, in an election in 1960, money counted for way less than it does today. Why? There are big corporations, there are rich people. Why? And the answer was, well, because a lot of the way you fought an election in 1960 depended on non-financial resources. You needed to get people to the polls or knock on doors. It was unions versus Protestant churchwomen. Those were the people who did it. You had this tightly knit associational society, and the Democratic and Republican Party were not just things that you checked a box to. People would actually have friends. They'd go to meetings. It was an important part of the organization of social life, especially the Democratic Party. And so, the money could buy ads, but that's not how you did all the other work of politics. In recent years, I describe this more lonely and isolated societies. All those institutions have weakened. As unions have weakened, as church-going has weakened, as just the sense of belongingness and participation, as Americans have become more isolated. All of those things that used to happen spontaneously as part of the normal social fabric now have to be paid for. And that's where the money goes. So the power of money is very visible, but the retreat of the other things that made politics go before the Watergate reforms, that's less visible. And I think that's every bit as much of the story. And that's why I think the campaign against money in politics can never be successful. Because you cannot legislate the money out unless the things the money is doing are done for other reasons by other people. And that requires a different kind of social organization than America's had for the past generation. Yes, sir.
I saw you on Bill Maher's show last week.
Bill Maher show. I have a new best friend.
When the movie Scaramucci came on, and the whole tenor changed, but you confronted him about some dealings he had with a Chinese company.
Yeah.
And then the consequences of what happened after he was ousted from the White House. But Bill Maher didn't seem to want to go there because it wasn't part of the agenda. But could you explain a little of that?
Yeah. So I had this altercation with Anthony Scaramucci, the president's 11-day communications advisor. And I mean, it didn't go the way I thought it would. I mean, we're in Orange County, where the Real Housewives come from. I never thought I would be on the receiving end of a TMZ rant. But Scaramucci, after this, he went out to dinner and he called TMZ. I didn't know that that's how you got on TMZ. My daughter had to explain this to me. The way you get on TMZ is that it isn't like TMZ has teams of roving cameras going through Beverly Hills. You actually have to call them and say, Lindsay Lohan has some things to say about Paris Hilton if you get here in the next 10 minutes. And that's what he did. And I was kind of on about it. So I don't want to, there's a lot of, I was asking him about a story I did not understand. So I'm not going to pretend that I have some big secret about this. But what I saw was a financial transaction that I found puzzling. So Scaramucci ran a fund called Skybridge Capital. They had a bad it was a hedge fund, but it was a fund of funds, which is the most expensive kind of hedge fund. It's a hedge fund that buys other hedge funds. And its business proposition was hedge funds are normally, as you know, for big investors, $10 million or at least $1 million. And Skybridge worked in the space where they were selling pieces of hedge funds for $250,000. So doctors, lawyers, engineers, accountants, that kind of person could buy into the fund in a way that would not have been if it was a minimum $10 million entry. Skybridge had a bad 2016. A lot of money exited the fund. The fund was in trouble. And then Scaramucci got very interested in politics. He got this nod from President Trump, and at that point a buyer appeared. And the buyer was a very shadowy group of a Chinese group. Again, there's nothing wrong with doing business with China. It's the second biggest economy in the world, and a lot of Chinese money, even if it's wrung from the tears of children in sweatshops, by the time it comes to the United States, it's processed into legally proper forms, and you're not going to ask people, hey, here's a company and it's trading on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange and it's got proper financial statements and they want to make an investment in your factory. You're not going to tell people they can't do that. But when you have really strange and mysterious money and we can't know who the owners are and they're buying a troubled company in which this important advisor of the president, and then once he loses his job, suddenly the deal stalls. And again, there may be all kinds of innocent explanations for that. And that's what I asked Scaramucci. How am I to understand this? And I know a little bit about it. Obviously, he knows 100 times as much. And what I was sort of expecting to happen was that he would answer. And what I did not expect to happen was he would completely flip out on TV and stay flipped out for the next 20 minutes, which I guess is a kind of answer too. So I think that's what was going on. I don't want to suggest there's anything improper about this because, that's a serious accusation and I just don't know. But he certainly was unready to answer a very basic question about financial integrity from somebody who's going to be one of the senior-most figures in the White House. When you think about what past officials who have served in White Houses have willingly done to reassure people, that it was just a striking contrast.
Just one more question. There are many more out there.
Why don't you choose?
It seems to me that the Republicans in Congress have completely let us slow down, and that they could actually band together and do something about Trump. Why not? They're so ethically compromised.
Why don't the Republicans do it? Why don't the Republicans band together? That's a complicated, that has both political answers and psychological answers. Look, politics is not usually a line of work you go into if you want to be a hero. Politicians are pleasers. Politicians live at the junction point between the forces they command. This is one of the big themes of my book. What had happened, the Republican Party in Congress had become way more radical than the Republican Party in the country, or at least more economically radical. And that's why they were so vulnerable to Donald Trump's challenge in the first place. Rank and file Republicans were signaling all through the second Obama term, this is what the Tea Party was all about. They wanted more Medicare, less immigration, and no more Bushes. And Jeb Bush said, right, I've got $110 million here that says less Medicare, more immigration, and one more Bush. And Donald Trump's, and the people who sort of ran that process are shell-shocked because they discovered their own voters hated them. And I have a lot of detail in the book about how unpopular the Republican leadership in Congress was with Republican primary voters. And so they've had a little bit of the fear of the voter put into them. And they also feel, and it's very disorienting if you're in politics, you don't know your constituency anymore. And there's something going on here. And then the only way to salvation they see is by sticking closely to Donald Trump. And then he's delivered a lot of things they want, including the tax cut.
Many complicated issues, but a lot of good ideas for topics for next year. So
Thank you.
Forward
Thank
to
you all.